maybe it shouldn't matter. My own personal view is we should care about all of these creatures, regardless of age. But there's something all the more poignant and tragic, I think, and sad about an animal who's very old, falling victim to a fishing net or spear fisherman's spear.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Jonathan Balcombe. Jonathan is a biologist with a PhD in ethology, the study of animal behavior. He is the author of 4 popular science books on the inner lives of animals, including Pleasurable Kingdom, Second Nature, and What a Fish Knows, a New York Times bestseller. He has published over 60 scientific papers and book chapters on animal behavior and animal protection. His recent story in Nautilus was that snapper you're eating might be 80 years old. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
To start off, would you mind summarizing your background intellectually and as a writer for our viewers?
Sure. My scholarly training is in biology with a focus on ethology, which is the study, the study of animal behavior. I did my master's and PhD on communication in bats, but I consider myself a generalist. I'm interested in all kinds of animals. I've also written a book called Superfly, a recent book all about the lives of flies. I mentioned that partly to illustrate that from fishes to flies to elephants, it's all grist for my mill. I enjoy writing about all of that. So my career was in mostly in animal protection, but since starting to write books 15 years ago, I've focused now on leveraging my knowledge and my skills to try to change attitudes towards animals through writing essays, op-eds, but mostly books.
How did you get interested initially in science and in studying animal behavior specifically?
I think maybe the most blunt answer is I was born, and I say that because from my earliest memory, I've had an unending fascination with animals and what they do. As soon as I was old enough to explore the backyard, I was out there looking at wasps and flies and mosquitoes and ants and whatever I could find. Just a very deep-seated fascination, but also concern for animals. I remember as a child, if I was walking with someone and they stepped on an ant deliberately or a caterpillar, I was just like, I felt more alienated from that kid than I did from the victim under their shoe. I've always had a strong, abiding concern for and caring about animals, which is probably why I leveraged my biology training into working in for nonprofits, trying to make the world a better place for other animals.
Where did you grow up? Where were you exploring as a child and
Yeah,
fostering your connection with animals?
my parents, in particular, my mother was very adventurous, and we did a lot of traveling. I was born in England, and then at age 3, we traveled by boat. In those days, ship travel wasn't that rare. This was 1962. We took a boat to Auckland, New Zealand, and lived in New Zealand for 5 years, which is probably my early formative years. And I should credit my parents to also having a great interest and concern for animals, and that certainly both genetically and environmentally affected me as well. Then when I was 8, we moved to Canada. I'm actually speaking here from Canada, in the town of Belleville, a little east of Toronto. I spent 20 years growing up and being a young adult in Canada. Left for grad school to do a PhD at the University of Tennessee when I was 28 years old. Lived for 31 years in the United States and returned to Ontario 4 years ago. So I've had a bit of travel in my years.
Were your parents in the world of science at all? What was the reason for all the traveling early on?
Mm. My mother was in education. She was a teacher and became a school administrator later. And my dad was in art. He was a commercial artist, had a great deal of natural skill in art, and won a scholarship at the age of 14. But his parents needed him to work, so he went and worked as a mechanic, and he griped about that for his whole life. But he did get into art and became a commercial artist and a painter in later years. So neither of my parents were scientists, but they were inquiring minds, curious, fascinated about things, and they were very nurturing of my interest in science.
That's cool. Could you give us a brief summary of your story that you recently wrote for us, for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, I mean, in researching What a Fish Knows, which came out now 6 years ago, I discovered a lot of interesting things about fishes. There's so much that so many ways we underestimate them. But this age thing, this longevity, is fascinating. I mean, just how long these animals can live. The snapper and the title, I mean, 80 years. I mean, that's pretty impressive in itself. And yet, they're youngsters compared to orange roughies, which have been estimated to be close to 250 years old in some cases. And this is an ordinary bony fish, not particularly big. Mind you, Greenland sharks do grow to over 5 meters, so they are a big fish, and they swim very slowly around the ice in the Arctic, and they are the current record holders of vertebrate longevity. There's a quahog, a kind of clam that lives over 500 years, and there may be a few Greenland sharks that are over 500 that are swimming out there, based on, sadly and poignantly, analyses of tissues that are only gotten from dead sharks. So, ironically, these animals we find out how old they are, and it's actually past tense. How old were they when we caught them in a fishing net, and, accidentally or incidentally, or trawler and what have you. So that's part of the theme of the article, is that despite the longevity, the venerable age that these animals live to, who knows what kind of wisdom they might carry in their minds. Despite that, we're indiscriminate in our methods of catching these animals. Nets and trawlers don't discriminate on the age of the victim. Maybe it shouldn't matter. My own personal view is we should care about all of these creatures, regardless of age. But there's something all the more poignant and tragic, I think, and sad about an animal who's very old falling victim to a fishing net or spear fisherman's spear.
Yeah, I agree. What was the impetus or the inspiration for writing about fish longevity now?
Just a general theme, we underestimate animals, and so that's always an impetus for me, is to try to provide people with information that will hopefully raise eyebrows and drop jaws, and who knows, maybe even change behavior. Behavior may be going fishing, or food choices at the supermarket. These are all really important issues in terms of planetary health. It's estimated that fish populations in general overall have declined about 50% in the last 50 years or so. Same thing for insects. We are living in the Anthropocene. I was shocked to learn from an article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a very venerable journal, recently, that the biomass of mammals on Earth, and you can make the same claim pretty much for vertebrates in general, is currently now 96% wildlife is 4%. Wild vertebrate animals on the planet make up 4% of the whole. The remaining 96% is 36% humans, 60% livestock, animals that are raised for human consumption. So you can see how food choices are a really critical component of the dysfunctionality and the imbalance of life we currently have on the earth in the Anthropocene. I think it's a really powerful word, Anthropocene. The era that is dominated by human activity.
So you covered a lot of this area in your book, What a Fish Knows. Can you tell us any interesting tidbits that you came across in your research for that book that didn't make it into the piece about the longevity of snappers and other fish? What can you say about fish cognition that many people probably don't appreciate or even know about?
Yeah, there's so much to be said there. Fish have great memories. They have great individual recognition skills. They have soulmates, individuals who they consort with and know and presumably care about. They show artistic creativity and nest building. They show culture. They fall for the same optical illusions we fall for. They I guess I should elaborate on that a little bit. You can train a fish, for instance, to poke their nose against the larger of two circles when they're presented with two circles. I give them a little food reward for that, and then present them with the Ebbinghaus illusion, which is two identical orange circles with the colors don't matter so much. Two identical circles with dots around them of different sizes. It's a strong optical illusion, and one of those identical circles looks bigger than the other. And these fishes, various species, have been tested in this and other optical illusions. They will, when presented with the Ebbinghaus illusion, they'll go to the larger, the one that looks larger, and poke their nose or push the button or whatever the routine is, to indicate that that's the one they think is larger. That's telling. It tells you that the fish can have beliefs, and those beliefs can be fallible, can be wrong. I mean, nature's full of deception, and that's one way that deception works, because you can fool another. So that's just a little more detail about that. There's another mind-blowing study where fishes were subjected to stressful procedures. They were caught, then put in a bucket of shallow water for 30 minutes. Very stressed. How do you measure that? You take a small blood sample from the tail vein, and you can measure very high cortisol, stress hormone, same one we have. And then these animals were given an opportunity to get caresses, to get stroked from a model of a fish that will use caressing as a way to facilitate cleaning behavior. That's a whole other thing that's fascinating. But back to the stress study, these stressed surgeon fishes, when they had the opportunity to get strokes, they would swim up to that model and get strokes, an average of 15 times an hour. Scientists have to measure things and to make their case. Fishes who, in a control group, who the model fish couldn't give them strokes, it just was stationary. They didn't visit it at all. They didn't have any reason to go there, because it couldn't deliver caresses that would cause them stress relief. The individuals in the first, getting the strokes, their stress hormones came down rapidly and profoundly. The other ones didn't. So again, a bit of detail on another study that I think says so much more about fishes than we routinely credit them with. They have inner lives. They're individuals with personalities. I like to say they don't just have biology, they have biographies. And we tend to view them and treat them as we see them in the market, just a rows of anonymous, they look similar individuals. Well, we don't think of them as individuals. It's a salmon instead of that particular individual who had a unique life. So a big part of, that's a bit long-winded, but a big part of what I try and do with the writing of What a Fish Knows, is to impress upon people that there's so much more to these animals than we're typically aware of. Not always through our own fault. I mean, it's just the information is not available, which is why I try to write books that people will want to read.
Yeah, I think people are more familiar with how important memory is and longevity is in creatures like elephants, where so much learning and teaching happens about where important resources are and how pivotal a leader in a group can be to maintaining cohesion. Is there anything similar with long-lived fish? Do they play a similar role in their groups?
It's a great question. I don't know a direct analogy, a strong analogy to say the elephant who knows where the particular type of trees start fruiting, maybe every 3 years, and they know where the watering hole is at this particular time in year that we need to go there. And they've learned the infrasonic communication, where elephants can communicate sort of seismically through vibrations in their feet. Now, fishes have just as sophisticated forms of communication, but in terms of elderlies passing on knowledge to youngers, that hasn't really been looked into much. I can tell you that fishes have culture. They pass the test of what scientists define as culture, which is non-heritable, that is not genetically carried traits that nevertheless get passed on from generation to generation. That's passed on through learning, through observation. So maybe even through teaching. So the types of behaviors that may match the sort of thing that we've seen in elephants and whales as well. It's thought that with the decline of whales, not fish, they're not fishes, of course, they're mammals, but the decline of whale populations and I should say, the failure of whale populations to recover, certain species to recover with the mostly end of whaling, it's not completely ended. Um, that's sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Um, it's thought to be because we don't have other whales, older whales, to teach them anymore. They were all whaled out when whaling was going on. So I don't have a direct analogy there, but fish culture has been demonstrated in one or two research studies. Again, these studies are not widely done. I am happy to say that science is asking questions now about animal behavior that it wasn't asking for much of the 20th century. Scientists are now, it's not considered taboo to ask questions about what thoughts and emotions are these animals feeling. And we see that more and more, and that's encouraging to me.
Do you think there's any hesitation or resistance to studying fish more in depth because they are such a huge resource that we rely on for food, and perhaps we don't want to know too much about what their lives are like because we it's easier to eat them that way?
Yeah, that phenomenon may be at play. You said it. I could only repeat it. I mean, I think we generally we don't like to be confronted with information that may conflict with what we thought. And as for making behavioral changes or dietary changes, it's sort of an act of denying or rejecting a way you thought for a long time, repudiating a set of views about things. Tomorrow. I'm going to with a local organization, or I think it's a couple of days in a couple of days' time, to a dairy farm near me, and I don't like what I know about the practice of dairy farming, taking calves away from cows. Um, and But I want to be educated, enlightened, and see an example in action. Um, and as for fish, well, fishing is commercial fishing and recreational fishing. First of all, huge numbers of animals are taken, possibly over 1 trillion in the case of commercial fishing. Hard to fathom numbers like that. And the methods of dying are pretty awful. Crushing in the nets, decompression, suffocation, sometimes exsanguination if the animal's gills are cut on the boat deck. None of it's a very nice way to go. Often fishes are dumped onto ice, and that slows down their process of death. Recreational fishing, being hooked in the face and dragged into the boat, and then maybe released. And even then, mortality is not insignificant after release. But some fish biologists estimate over 45 billion fishes are killed or taken, caught recreationally every year. So these are not very savory facets. And let's mention aquaculture too, the fish farming. It's basically factory farming of fishes, and there are all sorts of ecological and ethical concerns about the conditions for these animals and situations. So back to your point, it's so important that people be aware of that, because we need to be informed consumers. It's better. It's so much more important to be an informed consumer than an uninformed consumer. So what people do with the information is up to them, of course. I would say it's very empowering to know that your food choices every day can make an impact, positive or negative, on the environment and on animal welfare.
Speaking of that, have there been any signs or messages you've received or feedback about the impact your story has had? What response have you seen?
Yeah, I have had a handful of emails have come to my desk from people who've read this article, and positive. Often, when I get feedback from folks who've read my work, are sort of it's the preaching to the converted type thing. Um, but definitely, people have different viewpoints on these matters. But the sense I get is that people are surprised to learn that fishes can live so long, and they like the fairly fish friendly tone that I take in what I express in the article.
Hmm. All right, to wrap up, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online, whether you're on social media, and help them follow your work more often?
Sure, I have a website that I update far too infrequently, but it's jonathan-balcombe.com. I also am pretty active on Facebook. I'm 63, and I'm at an age where the whole computer technology thing isn't really necessarily my favorite uh, thing. But I do see the importance in it. So I have an author page on Facebook. I also have a personal page on Facebook. I do tweet on rare occasions, but not very often. I'm more likely to be watching birds than sounding like one.
Right on. Well, I encourage everybody to go check out Jonathan's pages and follow his work. It's really good stuff. Thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
A real pleasure too, Brian. Thanks for having me.